practices from other societies into the interpretation of the religion. And identity politics has a great deal to do with it. But I say women should be free to choose. But there is no compulsion and there is no requirement for them to veil themselves.
Despite the best efforts of his enemies to discredit him through his marriages, Muhammad had used them to confirm and widen his power base in Arabia. He could now turn his attention again to Mecca. In early 628 AD, he told his followers that they were going to set out to perform the annual Hajj rites at the Kaaba in Mecca. For Muhammad and his followers, the Kaaba had become central to their worship, the place to which they turned in prayer. They believed it had been originally built by the Prophet Abraham and regarded it as the ultimate symbol of their faith, the unity of the one God, Allah. But access to the Kaaba was controlled by Muhammad's enemies, the Quraysh, the rulers of Mecca. It contained shrines to the hundreds of gods worshipped by all the tribes in Arabia. Muhammad was now determined to challenge their control of this sacred shrine.
The Prophet announces that he is going to make the Hajj. Must have been astonishing, because on the Hajj you are not allowed to carry weapons. He was going unarmed into the enemy territory.
It's when, again, you touch the magic of Muhammad as a man. He fought wars, and now he just said, right, we're off to pray to God.
Muhammad and the convoy of followers were forced to stop here at Hudaybiyah, which is about 8 miles outside of the holy city, because the Quraysh had reacted with characteristic aggression and they had sent a cavalry in order to stop the convoy. And so began a series of frenetic negotiations with emissaries going between Muhammad and the Quraysh. They eventually arrived at an agreement. But the so-called Treaty of Hudaybiyah, signed at a spot marked by the mosque just behind me, looked like the most humiliating of compromises for Muhammad. The Quraysh insisted that Muhammad and his followers return to Medina without performing the Hajj rites. They also insisted that all raids on Meccan caravans by the Muslim forces under Muhammad's command should stop. In return, they would allow Muhammad and his followers to return to Mecca as pilgrims to perform the Hajj, but only in the following year. And when it came to signing the document which describes Muhammad as the messenger of God, the Quraysh emissary objected, saying that to them he was only Muhammad, the son of Abdullah. For Muhammad's followers, this was an unbearable insult. According to Muslim tradition, when Muhammad's young cousin Ali, who was doing the writing, heard this, he refused to strike out the words, the messenger of God.
Muhammad says, give me the pen, point out the words, messenger of God, and he strikes it out himself. See it as a striking out of ego there, not standing on your rights. The Quran says that if the enemy asks for peace, you must lay down your arms immediately and accept any terms, however disadvantageous.
For Muhammad's followers, the terms of this treaty, and particularly the treatment of Muhammad, were completely humiliating. It was only Muhammad's adamant attitude that kept them from mutiny. What Muhammad was trying to do was totally unheard of in 7th century Arabia. In a society of honor, traditionally blood feuds ruled the day. But after years of bloody but inconclusive conflict, Muhammad now wanted to defeat his enemies not through war but by peace. By signing a truce with the Quraysh, he had not only gained access to the Kaaba, albeit at a later date, but also extracted from them the crucial acknowledgement that he and they were now equals.
In the sense, Hudaybiyah does represent a minimal option, which is that, okay, we can't get what we want now, but we can get it in future if we make this agreement. And a truce in which people were not fighting was always preferable to war. This is again something which is Quranically given, that, you know, peace is better than war. It's repeated again and again. So it very much fits within that particular type of principle.
As he and his followers were returning to Medina, Muhammad then received a new revelation, confirming that the Treaty of Hudaybiyah was not a humiliating defeat.
He said, I've just had a revelation. He said, this was a manifest victory, says God. It may look like a defeat, but it was a manifest victory. The Quraysh were filled with all the violence of the old tribal spirit, and they were filled with contempt and pride. It was the Muslims, the spirit of peace, that filled their hearts. Sometimes this is forgotten. We hear all about Muhammad's wars, but we forget this extraordinary non-violent offensive. After Hudaybiyah, the tide had turned in his favor with a campaign of non-violence.
The Treaty of Hudaybiyah marks a turning point in Muhammad's attempts to spread his message throughout Arabia, but it also shows that he was prepared to suffer the utmost humiliation from his worst enemies in pursuit of peace. And yet in today's world, the commonly held view of Muhammad is that he is the enemy of peace, and that Islam is the religion of jihad, commonly taken to mean holy war. Thousands have been killed all over the world by groups that are now called jihadi, a term never used in Muhammad's time. And yet, these groups all claim the Quran and Muhammad himself as inspiration and justification for their actions.
It's very clear, brothers and sisters, that the path of jihad and the desire for martyrdom was deeply embedded in the Holy Prophet ﷺ and their beloved companions.
Most so-called jihadis usually refer to a verse in the Quran, now known as the sword verse, as justification for their violent acts.
If you come back to the Quran, you have these verses. No one can deny that there are verses very, very much dealing with war and violence. Now, as we have to deal with the Quran, it's an eternal book dealing with history. These verses were revealed in a very specific period of time where the Muslims were under oppression and trying to resist and just to survive. So we have to contextualize this. The mainstream classical tradition in the Shia and the Sunni tradition are saying, you can't use these verses just to promote war and to kill innocent people. This is wrong.
The interpretation of individual Quranic verses goes to the heart of this controversy. But most scholars now agree that the term jihad does not mean holy war. Its real meaning is completely different.
The concept of jihad emerges out of the Holy Quran, out of the revelation that the Prophet receives. And there are about 35 examples in the Quran of the word jihad, or the term basically being used, and often in the case of striving. Now, striving can be all sorts of things. It can be striving against the baseness of one's self. It can be seeking to overcome evil and being good. It can be striving in the sense of fighting. But jihad is always distinguished from fighting, and a different terminology is used for the word fighting.
In all the battles that Muhammad fought, the rules of engagements were always carefully delineated within the context of his time and what was generally acceptable. But there are no recorded instances of deliberate attacks on civilian populations.
One of the points about jihad in the early Islamic tradition, both in the Prophet's lifetime and afterwards, is that it's a gradual evolution of an idea towards something like a just war. And the just war is a constraint on the army, does not attack or massacre civilians, doesn't kill women, children, doesn't kill priests of other religions, incidentally, and so on. And this draws on the practice in the lifetime of the Prophet.
These rules of engagement appear to have been forgotten by today's Muslim extremists. Suicide bombers kill people not only in Western cities, but also in mosques and other places of worship in the Muslim world itself. In Britain today, no Muslim activist or group will openly defy the law by accepting or agreeing to the use of violence. But over the last 10 years, more than 200 Muslims have been convicted of terrorist-related offences. In 2008, Abdul Muhid was convicted and jailed for 2 years for terrorist funding. Mizan ur-Rahman was charged for soliciting murder and jailed for 4 years in 2006. Both have now served their sentences, but still have strong views about the role of jihad in today's world.
Has the modern interpretation of jihad changed in any way? Because for most people today, jihad means just one thing, doesn't it? It means fighting in the physical struggle.
The scholars of Islam in the past, they all agreed that jihad means fighting against the non-Muslims, yes, but not just for the sake of enforcing them to be a Muslim, but to make the word of Allah the highest by removing the obstacles from the implementation of the Sharia and from the call to Islam to spread across the world.
From your interpretation of the Prophet's life, I mean, is it permissible at any time in jihad to attack non-combatants?
If I just cut straight to the point, the argument of Islamic terrorists is this. If you choose a government that represents you and they decide to bomb a country or kill people, then you have blood on your hands. It's like hiring, for example, a murderer. You know, if I pay a murderer to go and kill someone, it's not just the murderer that's blameworthy. I share that blame. So if you say by non-combatants, these people are voting for a government that is carrying out crimes, then they share the blame. And then obviously in their eyes of the Islamic terrorists, they are blameworthy.
These ideas are abhorrent to Muslims and non-Muslims and would have been unrecognizable to Muhammad. For him, the concept of jihad was not just simply about killing and war, but it was about striving to improve yourself in the eyes of God. There is the concept of just war in Islam, and Muhammad himself fought many battles, but for him, there was no justification of the killing of innocent people. Muhammad's peaceful jihad was now about to come to fruition. Under the terms of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, he could embark on a journey that would take him back to the city of his birth, the city he had left nearly 7 years ago as a refugee, penniless and in fear of his life. He was now returning as the head of an ever-expanding religious community, the most powerful leader in Arabia. In February of 629, Muhammad agreed with the Quraysh to be allowed back into Mecca in order to visit the Kaaba. The Quraysh agreed to allow Muhammad and his followers into the Kaaba for 3 days. And yet, during that time, it marked a change in people's perceptions towards Muhammad and his followers. The people of Mecca saw the Muslims enter the Kaaba and they observed how well behaved they were, how sincere they were, and it was important because it showed that slowly but surely the stranglehold of the Quraysh in Mecca was beginning to crumble. A year later, the Quraysh broke the truce by attacking one of Muhammad's allies. It was a fatal mistake. In January 630, the Prophet gathered a massive army of 10,000 men and marched towards Mecca. The Quraysh were powerless to resist, and they fully expected Muhammad to storm into Mecca and exact a bloody revenge for the many years of persecution and war. Their control of the city was at an end. But it was what he did next, that this his hour of ultimate victory, that left people stunned. Muhammad declared that he forgave all his former enemies. He then said that there was to be a general amnesty, and he said that no one was to be forced to convert to Islam. Instead of revenge, Muhammad consciously chose reconciliation.
The conquest of Mecca is very important because there's a wide-ranging amnesty given, and people were given options of accepting the faith or going elsewhere or whatever. But certainly there was this notion that, okay, once Mecca is taken, and Mecca is considered to be the cultic center now of this new faith, certainly the first stage of the mission is complete, so there's no need for fighting.
For Muhammad, this was the moment he had been waiting for. He had come back to Mecca not to kill the Quraysh, but to restore the Kaaba to its role as the sacred shrine to the one God. According to Muslim tradition, when he and thousands of his followers entered the Kaaba, they destroyed the many gods and effigies placed there.
Seems to me that that's the heart and essence of the life of the Prophet, the moment it was building to. From what I understand and know of the personality of the Prophet,